Marian Aldcroft did not weep. Not when Wesley pushed back his chair and addressed the Goddard table. Not when the silence moved across the room in the particular way silence did when a thing had been said that could not be unsaid. Not when she looked at Conrad Goddard's face and understood, by the slight settling of his expression, that Wesley had discussed this with him beforehand. That the performance was for the other guests. That she was the last person in the room to know what was happening. She was 29 years old. She had believed herself a practical woman. She had been wrong, it turned out, about what she was practical about. The marriage had been arranged in the way that arrangements were made between families who had dwindled from different directions. The Revels from loss of income, the Aldcrofts from loss of social standing, after Wesley's father's debts came due. What remained on each side was an asset the other needed. Dr. Philip Revell had a name, a daughter of marriageable age, and a medical patent filed 3 months before his health began to fail. Wesley Aldcroft had mills, connections, and the kind of confidence that made people mistake motion for direction. Marian had not expected love. She had expected civility, and she had received something close to it for the first several months. Wesley was not unkind by nature. He simply did not see her clearly, not as a person but as an arrangement, a component of a larger calculation that he was conducting simultaneously on several fronts. She had noticed this gradually, the way you noticed a room growing cold, not in a single moment but in the accumulation of small details. She had told herself it was enough. A household to manage. Accounts that needed someone careful with numbers. Her father's work to think about in the evenings when Wesley was at the mills or the club. She had told herself that was sufficient. She had stopped telling herself that approximately 4 months before the Goddard dinner. The Goddard house was the kind of house that announced its own importance from the street. Brick and iron, 3 stories. The windows blazing on a September evening with the particular warmth of candlelight that existed for other people's benefit. Conrad Goddard was the kind of man who required an audience for his generosity. He had invited 11 families to dinner. He had seated Wesley at the right end of the table, and Marian beside him, and for the first 40 minutes the conversation had been the pleasant, circulating kind that took place when money and ambition shared good wine, and no one had yet said anything that mattered. Then Wesley stood. He did not look at her when he began speaking. That was the detail she would remember later, not the words themselves, but the angle of his face. Turned toward Goddard. She was not the intended audience for any of it. "There is a matter," he said, "that affects the terms of our partnership. I believe in directness." A pause, calibrated. The Revell patent, the medical formulation that formed part of the asset foundation of this arrangement, has proven more complicated to access than I had represented. Complicated to access, as though she were a locked drawer. My wife has expressed reservations about the transfer. He said it with the tone of a man expressing genuine regret about an inconvenient weather pattern. I cannot, in good conscience, proceed with the Goddard partnership while this question remains open. As the question appears to hinge on Mrs. Aldcroft's willingness to cooperate with what this household requires. He stopped, looked at his hands. I am pursuing a legal separation. The matter will be addressed through proper legal channels. Marian heard the words with the strange doubled clarity of a person receiving news that her body understood, before her mind had finished processing it. She heard the intake of breath from the woman 2 seats down. She saw Flora Goddard's eyes drop to the tablecloth, with the practiced invisibility of a young woman who had learned that the safest response to a scene was to pretend not to be present for it. She looked at Wesley. Not with grief, not with anger. Those would come later, at their own pace, when she gave them permission. What she felt was simpler and colder than either. She felt as though a door she had been leaning on had been pulled open, and the ground was exactly where it had always been, and she was still standing. She set her napkin on the table, folded, rose. "Thank you," she said. To the table in general, clearly, because her voice was not going to shake, and she had decided that before she opened her mouth. "Mr. Goddard, Miss Goddard, I'll leave you to your evening." She walked out. The hall was cool and dim after the candlelight. She found her coat on the rack near the door. She put it on herself. Outside, the Aldcroft carriage was waiting. She gave the driver the address and sat in the dark interior, and felt the city moving past and thought. Not about Wesley, not yet. About the letter her father had written. "This is for Marian." She understood the work. "Make sure she keeps it." She had read that letter 3 times. She had thought it was sentiment. She understood now it was instruction. The days that followed were precise in their unpleasantness. Not catastrophic. The catastrophe was what Wesley had hoped for, she thought later. The visible collapse that would confirm his narrative, that she had been a liability, and he had been the reasonable one to act. What she gave him instead was the mundane and unhelpful continuation of ordinary life. She answered correspondence. She managed the household accounts. She went to the market on Thursday, because Thursday was when the good produce arrived, and she had been going on Thursdays for 2 years. And she was not going to alter her Thursdays, because Wesley Aldcroft had stood up at the Goddard table. 2 women called on her in the first week. She received them. She thanked them. She moved on. The third was Selina Morse. Selina Morse was 63 years old, twice widowed, and ran the most profitable dry goods import concern between Boston and Providence. She had built it after her first husband left her a lease on a failing warehouse, and the good sense to stop mourning the business and start understanding it. She had expanded after the second husband's death into European textiles and coastal shipping, and she did all of this with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had decided, somewhere in her 40s, that other people's opinions of her ambition were their problem to manage, not hers. She arrived on a Wednesday morning, without sending word. Marian received her in the front parlor. "Sit," Selina said, which was not a question. She settled into the chair by the window as though she had been there before. "You know he's wrong about the patent." "I know." "Does your lawyer know you know?" Marian looked at her. "I have an appointment with Avery this afternoon." Something shifted in Selina's expression. Not surprise, more like confirmation of a thing she had suspected and was relieved to find accurate. "I've watched Wesley Aldcroft operate for 4 years, she said. "He's not a stupid man. He's a man who does his arithmetic and stops there. He looks at a thing and sees what it's worth on paper. He doesn't look at what it can do." Marian said nothing. "Your father's formulation has been used at Massachusetts General for 3 years, Selina continued. "I know this because the purchasing agent there is my cousin's husband. He said at the time that Dr. Ravel's compound was the most reliable antiseptic preparation they had worked with in a decade." She paused. "Wesley sees a patent as an asset to assign. He has not considered that the asset has a history and a reputation, and a great deal of interested parties." Marian looked at her own hands. She thought of her father in his study, the long evenings with the formula notebooks. His voice, patient and precise, explaining why a compound failed and what to adjust and how to test again. "I believe," Marian said carefully, "that there may be parties who have already expressed interest in a licensing arrangement." Selina's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did. The particular quality of attention belonging to a woman who had just been shown something she recognized. "Go see Avery," she said, "today." Mr. Avery had handled Dr. Ravel's affairs for 20 years, and Marian's for the 3 years since his death. He was 61, with the patient precision of a man who believed that the most important quality in legal practice was the willingness to read every document twice. He read the bequest language again at Marian's request, and then he set the paper down. "Your separate property," he said, "transferred at your father's death, before your marriage, protected under the Married Women's Property Act." He looked at her steadily. "Your husband has no claim on it, no authority to assign or license it, and no legal basis for representing it as part of the marital estate." "He represented it to Goddard as accessible," Marian said. "He represented a thing he did not own as though he owned it." Avery pressed his fingers together. "Which is a matter his attorney should have caught before any partnership terms were discussed." Marian reached into her satchel and set a leather folder on his desk. Avery opened it. He read. His expression changed in the small specific way it changed when a thing was more significant than he had anticipated. "My father's correspondence files," Marian said. "He filed every inquiry about the formulation. 2 pharmaceutical manufacturers had written him in the 18 months before his death. He noted the terms they had proposed." She paused. "He noted that one offer, from Harwick and Sons, had a response window." Avery looked up. "Marian, I know what it means." She folded her hands in her lap. "If the patent is licensed independently, the Goddard partnership fails. The mills lose the investment they need to service the machinery debt." She held his gaze. "I know the arithmetic, Avery. I have been keeping Wesley's accounts for 2 years." He was quiet for a long moment. The particular quiet of a man working through something complex and wanting to reach the end before he spoke. "Your father wrote to me the autumn before he died," he said finally. He asked me to ensure that if any party attempted to access the patent through you, rather than approaching you directly, you would be in a position to understand what was happening. Another pause. I thought at the time it was the worry of a sick man. I owe him an apology. Marian looked at the window. The September light was clean and direct. 4 days, she said. Can you reach Harwick in 4 days? She did not wait idly. She pulled out the household ledgers that evening, the ones she had maintained for 2 years, the ones Wesley had never examined closely because numbers bored him and she was thorough, and he trusted her thoroughness the way he trusted furniture, without thinking about it. She spread them across the table in her father's old study, and went through them the way her father had taught her to go through a formula, starting from known values, testing each assumption, not rushing the conclusion. The picture assembled itself plainly. The mills were leveraged against the Goddard investment. The Goddard investment was contingent on the patent. Without the patent, the investment terms would not hold. Without the investment, the machinery debt would outpace the mill's income within 2 seasons. Wesley had staked everything on the assumption that the patent was his to use. She had been in the house when that assumption was made. She had been present at dinners, had poured tea for Goddard and his associates, had sat across from Wesley at their own table, while he talked in general terms about expansion. She had asked questions once, practical questions, about what the debt service would look like in a slow season. And Wesley had looked at her with the polite, dismissive patience of a man who appreciated her willingness to take an interest and did not expect the interest to be informed. He had not answered. She had gone back to her accounts. She had found the answer herself, as it turned out. She had been finding things herself for some time. Selina came again on Thursday and brought, on request, a letter of endorsement from the surgical staff at Massachusetts General. The kind of endorsement that made pharmaceutical manufacturers pay closer attention than the numbers alone would require. You didn't need to do this, Marian said. I know. Selina looked out the window at the garden. Your father came to my second husband's funeral. He did not know William well, but he knew I had no family nearby, and he came because he thought it would matter. She turned from the window. It did. The Harwick agreement came back in 6 days. The terms were better than the notes had suggested. Avery said, when he read the final offer, that her father's correspondence files were the most thorough pre-negotiation record he had encountered in 30 years of practice. Marian signed on a Friday morning, in Avery's office, with the September light coming through the tall windows, and making the whole room look clean. She went home. She worked in the garden until she lost the light. She was there, hands in the soil, the late asters needing division, her mind on whether the south corner would hold lavender through a hard winter, when the housekeeper came to say Wesley had called. She took her time finishing what she was doing. She washed her hands. She went inside. He was standing near the parlor window. He looked as though the past week had done something permanent to his posture, a slight compression in the shoulders that had not been there before. The ease he carried, the ease of a man who had always known the outcome before he walked into the room, was gone. Goddard withdrew, he said. She waited. The patent is exclusively licensed to Harwick. He looked at his hands. Avery was thorough. He always is. Wesley looked up. Something moved across his face, not anger, not even blame exactly. The rawer thing that arrived when a man's calculations had failed so completely that he had run out of something to calculate. I married you, he said, and then stopped, as though the sentence had gone somewhere he hadn't expected. You married my father's patent, Marian said. She said it without sharpness, just as a fact. You married his name and the formula, and the filing he spent 11 years completing. You did it carefully and you did it politely and you believed, entirely, that it was reasonable. She looked at him steadily. You never asked me anything directly. Not what I thought. Not what I knew. Not whether I had any opinion about what you intended to do with what my father left me. Because it did not occur to you that I was a person in the equation. He said nothing. You told the Goddards I was an obstacle. Her voice stayed quiet and even. In the same way you'd describe a permit that hadn't cleared, or a parcel of land in disputed title. Something between you and the outcome you wanted. She paused. I was in the room, Wesley. I know. His voice was hollow. So was Flora Goddard. So was everyone who will ever do business with you again in this city. He absorbed that. What do you want? He asked. The question of a man who had run out of every other kind of question. What I've already secured, she said. My father's work, my own accounts, my name on the things that are mine. She stood. I don't want anything from you. I haven't for some time. That's rather the point. He left. She stood at the window and watched the carriage move down the street and felt something she had been waiting for, without knowing it. The specific, physical sensation of weight releasing. Not triumph. Nothing as bright as that. The quieter thing that came after. The feeling of having finally set something down. The legal separation was finalized in January. Marian moved to a smaller house in Beacon Hill in the spring. Smaller, and hers, with a south-facing study that had belonged to nobody, and therefore suited her exactly. The medical board work expanded. She attended meetings in the mornings, reviewed supply contracts in the afternoons, and in the evenings worked on an assessment Avery had asked her to write. A plain language explanation of how pharmaceutical licensing operated under the new property laws, so that the women on the board could understand what they were reviewing when endorsements came across the table. She wrote it in 2 weeks. Avery sent it to 3 colleagues. 2 of them asked to reprint it. She heard through the ordinary channels of a city where everyone knew someone who knew someone that Wesley had sold the Lawrence machinery and contracted the mills significantly. That the Goddard partnership had been restructured around something smaller and less ambitious. That Wesley himself had become, if not precisely humble, then at least quieter about the future. She did not take satisfaction in any of this in the way she had once, in the difficult early weeks, imagined she might. She had pictured vindication as something with a clear shape, a sound, a particular brightness. Instead, it felt like the settling of a long equation, all the variables finally accounted for. In October, the medical board held its annual dinner. Marian sat beside Petra Morse, Selena's niece, newly arrived from Providence to help with the annual audit, direct in the manner of a woman who had grown up watching a formidable woman work and had taken careful notes. My aunt says you're the best reader of a supply contract she's encountered in 20 years, Petra said, without particular ceremony, the way one professional might observe another's competence across a dinner table. Your aunt is generous. She's precise, Petra said. She doesn't give compliments for social reasons. I've watched her not do it for 30 years. A pause. The Harwick formulation, I understand it's going to 3 more hospital systems next year. 4, Marian said. There's an inquiry from Philadelphia. Petra nodded, the nod of a woman filing something in the place where useful information went. My aunt mentioned your father deserves the credit. He does, Marian said. I'm just making sure it goes where he intended. She picked up her fork. The conversation moved to the audit, to the supply chain, to a question about what the board's purchasing terms ought to look like in the next legislative session. The questions were specific and practical and interesting, and the woman beside her was sharp and ready to disagree when the thinking required it. And Marian found herself leaning forward with the focused attention that had always come naturally to her, when the work in front of her was real. Outside, Boston moved on with itself, indifferent and enormous, full of men who had underestimated things, and women who had kept accurate records, and the long, slow redistribution of consequence that followed when truth had enough time to finish what it started. Marian refilled her glass. There was still a great deal of work to do, and she had never been more certain of anything than the fact that she was exactly the right person to do it.